He expected a common bride, but the black beauty who arrived awakened a passion he couldn't control. The letter trembled in Elias Thornwood's calloused hands, its edges worn from days of being unfolded and read under the dim glow of a lantern. He stood alone in the vast emptiness of his Wyoming homestead, the wind howling across the plains like a mournful song, carrying the weight of his solitude. At 35, Elias had resigned himself to a life of quiet toil, his dreams of love buried beneath years of loss and labor. But the words scrawled on that fragile paper promised something he hadn't dared hope for since his youth: a wife. Not just any wife, but one chosen for him by a matchmaking service in Boston, a woman named Clara who would arrive by stagecoach in 3 days to share his life. He expected someone plain, practical, a woman suited to the harsh realities of frontier life, someone who could mend socks, churn butter, and endure the endless winters without complaint. What he didn't expect, what he couldn't have foreseen, was the storm of emotion that would descend upon him when the stagecoach door opened, revealing a woman whose beauty and spirit would unravel every certainty he held. Her name was not Clara, and she was no common bride. She was Amara, a vision of grace with skin like polished ebony, eyes that held both fire and sorrow, and a presence that would awaken in Elias a passion so fierce it threatened to consume him. As the Wyoming dust settled around her, Elias felt his heart lurch, caught between awe and fear, for he knew in that moment his life would never be the same. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the transformative power of love, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts. Your support helps us share stories that touch the soul and remind us all of the beauty in unexpected connections. Elias had always been a man of routine, his days governed by the rhythm of the land. The homestead he'd built with his own hands stood as a testament to his resilience, a sturdy cabin surrounded by fields of wheat that bowed under the weight of the wind. His life had not always been so solitary. 10 years ago, he'd been engaged to a schoolteacher named Margaret, a soft-spoken woman with a laugh like spring rain. But smallpox had claimed her, leaving Elias with a wound that never fully healed. Since then, he'd poured himself into his work, convincing himself that love was a luxury he could no longer afford. The matchmaking service had been a desperate act, born of lonely nights and the creeping fear that he'd grow old alone. He'd written to the agency with modest expectations, describing his needs plainly: a woman of good character, capable of hard work, someone to share the burdens of frontier life. He hadn't asked for beauty or passion, for he no longer believed himself worthy of such things. Yet, as he stood at the edge of town, watching the stagecoach rumble to a stop, his heart betrayed him with a flicker of hope. The door swung open, and Amara stepped out, her presence commanding the attention of every onlooker. She was tall, her figure draped in a simple blue dress that clung to her like a second skin, her hair braided intricately beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her skin glowed under the harsh midday sun, and her eyes, sharp and searching, met his with an intensity that made his breath catch. She was not the Clara he'd been promised, and the confusion that followed was only the beginning of his unraveling. The townsfolk whispered as Amara stepped onto the dirt street, their gazes a mix of curiosity and judgment. Elias felt their eyes on him, too, a man of modest means suddenly tethered to a woman who seemed to belong to a different world. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, her shoulders squared against the weight of their scrutiny, but there was a shadow in her expression that hinted at a deeper story. Elias approached her, his boots heavy against the ground, his mind racing with questions. The agency had sent a letter explaining the mix-up. Clara had fallen ill and could not travel, and Amara, a woman seeking a fresh start, had taken her place. The letter assured him she was capable, kind, and willing to honor the arrangement, but it said nothing of her past or why a woman of such striking beauty would choose a life in the wilderness with a stranger. Elias introduced himself, his voice rougher than he intended, and Amara's response was soft but firm, her accent carrying a trace of something foreign, perhaps the Carolinas or farther south. She offered no explanation for her presence, only a polite smile and a request to see the homestead. As they rode back in his wagon, the silence between them was heavy, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the distant cry of a hawk. Elias stole glances at her, his heart a battlefield of doubt and desire. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known, and the realization both thrilled and terrified him. The days that followed were a delicate dance of adjustment. Amara moved through the homestead with a quiet efficiency, learning the rhythms of the farm with a determination that surprised Elias. She churned butter, tended the garden, and even took to repairing a broken fence with a skill that spoke of experience. But there was a distance in her, a guardedness that kept Elias at arm's length. He sensed she carried a burden, a story she wasn't ready to share, and he didn't press her, though his curiosity burned. At night, as they sat by the fire, he watched her in the flickering light, her face a canvas of strength and vulnerability. She spoke little of herself, but when she did, her words were measured, chosen with care. She mentioned a childhood in Georgia, a family lost to hardship, and a journey north that had left her weary but unbroken. Elias found himself drawn to her resilience, her ability to face the world with grace despite its cruelties. Yet, he struggled with his own feelings, a growing attraction that felt both inevitable and forbidden. He'd expected a partner, not a woman who stirred something primal in him, something he hadn't felt since Margaret. The memory of his lost love haunted him, whispering that he was betraying her by letting Amara into his heart. He fought to keep his emotions in check, to maintain the practical arrangement they'd agreed upon, but every glance, every fleeting touch, threatened to undo him. The challenges of their new life were not only emotional but practical. The homestead was demanding, and the Wyoming winters were looming, promising months of isolation. Amara adapted quickly, but the townsfolk's whispers followed them, their prejudice a constant undercurrent. Elias overheard murmurs at the general store, snide remarks about a woman like Amara being unfit for a man like him. He bristled at their words, not because he disagreed, but because he feared they saw something he couldn't admit, that he was falling for her, and that his feelings were a weakness he couldn't afford. Amara, for her part, faced their judgment with a quiet strength, but Elias saw the toll it took in the way her shoulders tensed when they passed through town. One evening, as a storm rolled in, bringing thunder that shook the cabin, Amara revealed a piece of her past. She spoke of a life in Savannah, of a man who had promised her love but betrayed her, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that offered little mercy to a woman of her color. Her voice trembled as she described the journey that had brought her to Wyoming, a desperate bid for freedom from a past that still haunted her. Elias listened, his heart aching for her pain, and for the first time, he reached for her hand, his touch tentative but sincere. It was a small gesture, but it marked a turning point, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. As weeks turned to months, the dynamic between Elias and Amara began to shift. The harsh Wyoming landscape, with its endless skies and unforgiving winds, became a backdrop to their growing connection. Elias found himself seeking her out, not just for help with chores, but for her company, her quiet laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of the stars or the wildflowers that bloomed in the spring. Amara, too, began to soften, her guardedness giving way to moments of vulnerability. She shared stories of her childhood, of songs her mother sang, and Elias reciprocated with tales of his own, of boyhood adventures and the dreams he'd once held. They worked side by side, their hands brushing as they planted seeds or mended fences, each touch igniting a spark that neither could ignore. Yet, Elias wrestled with his feelings, torn between the passion Amara awakened and the guilt that clung to him like a shadow. He feared he was unworthy of her, that his simple life could never match the fire in her spirit. Amara, too, struggled, her past teaching her to guard her heart, to distrust the promises of men. But in Elias, she saw a kindness, a quiet strength that made her want to believe in second chances. The turning point came during a brutal winter storm, when the world outside the cabin was reduced to a blur of snow and ice. The fire in the hearth was their only defense against the cold, and as they sat together, wrapped in blankets, Amara began to sing. Her voice was low and haunting, a melody from her childhood that carried the weight of her sorrows and her hopes. Elias was transfixed, the sound weaving through him, stirring emotions he'd long buried. Without thinking, he reached for her, pulling her close, and for the first time, they embraced, their warmth a defiance against the storm outside. In that moment, the walls between them crumbled, and Elias knew he could no longer deny what he felt. He loved her, not as a practical partner, but as a woman who had awakened his soul. Amara, too, felt the shift, her heart opening to the possibility of a future she hadn't dared imagine. But their newfound closeness was tested by the arrival of a letter from the matchmaking agency, revealing that Clara, the original bride, had recovered and was now on her way to Wyoming, expecting to marry Elias. The news was a blow, threatening to unravel everything they'd built. Elias faced an impossible choice. Clara represented the life he'd planned, the safe, predictable arrangement he'd thought he wanted. But Amara was the life he hadn't dared dream of, a love that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He spent sleepless nights wrestling with his decision, his heart torn between duty and desire. Amara, sensing his turmoil, withdrew, her old fears resurfacing. She offered to leave, to spare him the burden of choosing, but the thought of losing her was unbearable. In a moment of clarity, Elias realized that his love for Amara was not a betrayal of Margaret, but a testament to his capacity to love again. He rode into town to meet Clara's stagecoach, his heart pounding as he prepared to tell her the truth. When he saw her, a plain, kind-faced woman with tired eyes, he felt a pang of guilt, but he spoke honestly, explaining that his heart belonged to another. Clara, though heartbroken, showed grace, wishing him well before boarding the next stagecoach east. Elias returned to the homestead, his decision made, and found Amara packing her belongings, her face streaked with tears. He stopped her, his words raw and unguarded, confessing his love, his fears, and his hope for a future together. Amara hesitated, her past whispering warnings, but the sincerity in Elias's eyes broke through her defenses. She stayed, and in that moment, they chose each other, not as a transaction, but as partners in a love that had defied all expectations. The years that followed were not without hardship. The homestead demanded constant work, and the townsfolk's prejudice lingered, though it softened with time as they witnessed the strength of Elias and Amara's bond. They built a life together, marked by small joys, a garden that flourished, a child born under the Wyoming stars, a love that grew deeper with each passing season. Elias learned to embrace his passion, to let it guide him rather than consume him, and Amara found healing in the safety of his love. Their story became a quiet legend in the town, a reminder that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, that beauty and strength could overcome even the harshest judgments. As Elias stood on the porch years later, watching Amara tend to their garden, her laughter mingling with the wind, he knew he'd found more than a bride. He'd found a home, a purpose, a love that had awakened him to life again. If this story of love, resilience, and second chances touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that remind us of the beauty in human connection. Before you go, please leave a comment sharing what moved you most about Elias and Amara's journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts.